Okay, good. All right. This is Historic Cosmology, Identity, and Exploration. And essentially what we're going to be talking about is the history of Western culture going back pretty much 2,500 years to the original Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian roots of everything. And that's where our language comes from. That's where our culture comes from. That's where a lot of our attitudes come from. And what I'm trying to get at is a lot of times, especially with the lack of classical education nowadays, people just don't understand what their words even mean. So we're going to try and get into what do these things mean in the root of these various concepts and how they got enculturated into us. And sometimes we feel things or think things because they're rooted in something that may be 1,000, 2,000 years old, but we have no idea where they came from. So we're going to get into that a little bit. So the goal, human exploration and settlement of the heavens. What does human mean in our classical understanding? What does heaven mean? What does exploration and settlement mean? What holds us back? What drives us forward? And then we're going to look at these in these three contexts here. We're also going to look at some of the historical implications. I originally gave this talk at 100 Year Starship on the inaugural of that event and was in a forum with Stuart Brand, who, when Steve Jobs passed away about 2 weeks after that, was the person that Steve Jobs considered his hero. So there was Russell Brand was all over the media because of the Whole Earth catalog and so forth. So I gave this talk originally in front of him. And so if I say DARPA for the first part, you'll see why. But this dovetails in with the talk I gave yesterday on the history of technology and so forth. In our current culture, short-term society has a strong reinforcement of speed. We do things in very, very short cycles now that we don't do. We have sort of a short attention span culture. We have very fast clock cycles. We have very fast travel. We have very fast business investment cycles. If something isn't paid for itself in 7 years in business, it's not worth doing. We tend to think of election cycles in terms of politics. So pretty much a lot of our cultural fabric is built on very short-term basis. However, in medieval culture, you built cathedrals that took over a century to build. And when DARPA said 100-year Starship, it was like, are we even capable of making something that lasts 100 years, like an organization or a starship or a long-term mission? When we think about long-term things in our modern culture, we tend to think of things that are, we have the promise of space settlement, but everything else we think about, gene banks, nuclear waste disposal, ecological hazards, economic threats, these are long-term hazards, but the only one that is a promise then is space settlement. It's the only hope in this matrix of division, pretty much everything here is, it's either, if it works, we have the status quo. Things are exactly the way they are now. But if they don't work, we collapse as a culture. So where's the hope of anything getting better except for in space settlement? So when you have tactics, when you have short-term thinking, but you don't have strategy, in business we call this flailing. This is, you're not swimming towards shore, you're just flashing around. So the psychology has positive reinforcement of tactical thinking, but negative reinforcement of strategic thinking. This is a motivator for cultural collapse if you don't reverse this to some degree, because you have the mechanism of apathy, atrophy, anarchy. If we assume we've done everything, we do nothing. If we assume we know everything, we've forgotten everything. If we assume there's no hope, we plan nothing. And in Proverbs, this is stated as where there's no vision, the people perish. However, we saw this in the Roman Empire when they thought they'd know everything. We saw this in the Victorian era when it was like, why study physics? We already know everything. We see this at moments of cultural stagnation. So cultures that exhaust themselves in place experience collapse. Easter Island built these wonderful monuments, and then they died. Cultures that spread to new environments experience restoration. This is the Nina, the Pinta Santa Maria as they were rebuilt for the Columbia Exposition about 100 years ago in Chicago. So on to that original question, human exploration and settlement of the heavens. So what does human mean in our current and historical context? Well, we have a body, a spirit, and a soul in the Judeo-Christian context. I'm putting my business hat back on again, the key performance indicators: body, health and fitness, spirit, energy and resolve, soul, integrity, independence, accountability. The body, interesting thing about the body is that we change every atom in our body about 98% of them every 6 months. It takes longer in tooth mammal. It's very short in the lungs, obviously. So we don't really have, we have a Greek concept of its form plus substance. The matter is here, but the form is really what my body is, because the matter is constantly circulating like wax through a candle flame. We call it the same candle flame, even though the wax is different. The atoms are different. It's not the same as this desk where the atoms are going to be the same a year from now. In spirit, we have the idea of the original language of that is pneumos, or breath. The idea of something being alive. We measure that in terms of the life of a person. We have the term esprit de corps. It can also be for a group. If you have an athletic event, you have an esprit. You have the idea of a team functioning as a common breath. It's a very interesting mechanism of a social connection. In Greek, they had the spirits of vegetative, animal, and rational. In other words, they went from the body to the spirit to the soul. That was their mechanism for it. The soul is really the eternal identity of a human being. If I ask you, who are you? And you give me an answer that is an attribute and not an entity, you are not answering my question. If I say, what's your name? If I say, who are you, and you tell me your name, you can change your name. And like I said, this body is a candle flame. That's not even your entity. What it really is if I ask you that question, the real answer is, I'm the one who's accountable for my actions in the end. I'm the one who's going to be remembered after I die. That's the permanence of it in terms that are both religious and secular. Who am I 100 years from now? So it's pretty much, and in Greek and Hebrew roots, it's the idea of the permanent divine heavenly that is bonded temporarily with mortal, earthly, or material body. So what does heavens mean? The first heaven you've heard second heaven or third heaven. The first heaven is the atmosphere, pretty much. It's the very dynamic things that we see with weather and so forth. The second heaven would be space. In Greek, it was the idea of the end of the transient and the beginning of the eternal. And in Dante, it started at lunar orbit. Anything beyond lunar orbit, because the moon changed every month. So there was this dynamic versus the static. Everything beyond lunar orbit, with the exception of the planets, the gods, moved around. Or it was static. So there was this idea of the further out it was, the more pure it was, the more mathematically excellent it was. It was more like the logos as opposed to the carne. In other words, the perfect word as opposed to the physical form that had limitations. So in the third heaven, we associated that with God, with Olympus in the case of the Greeks, but also the heavens, the permanent, the incorruptible, the eternal. In the Greek universe, it was like a settling pond. And it's described exactly that way in Ovid's Metamorphoses, which was about 100 years before the life of Christ. You have the ether, which was the permanent, beautiful thing out in the distance. Then the next layer was the fire, then the air, in other words, the atmosphere, and then water, and then earth. And you notice there's a dynamic of static versus dynamic, of excellent and pure and mathematical versus corrupt and changing and difficult. And then when Prometheus creates humans in Ovid's Metamorphoses, he takes mud, raindrops, and a little ether, just a little bit of mathematical purity, and combines them together. And there's a beautiful passage there where it says, humans are the only animal that stands upright and looks at the stars. And you have a bit of that in Genesis with God breathing his breath into the soil, into dirt. So you have that combination of the mud and the logos mix. So you have that in both aspects of Western tradition. What does exploration and settlement mean? This goes back to evolutionary biology to some degree. We have the idea of reproduction and locomotion as functions, one of the 10 life functions of respiration and everything. Those are the things that spread life from one location to another. There's two mechanisms. There's the passive method of plants and spiders and so forth, the R-selected species in evolutionary biology. And then there's the ones that intelligently move towards new food sources. The K-selected species, like wolves and whales and so forth, have a smaller domain, and they're more concerned about quality of life rather than quantity of life. And the process of exploration for a K-selected species like humanity is to develop awareness of a new environment evaluate the threats and opportunities, move personally into a new region, or move their offspring to a new location. So the metaphor for this I like to give is cats and dogs. This may not be scientific. This may be somewhat just a metaphor. Let's just put it that way. But a dog will charge into the middle of a room that it's never seen before. It'll sniff around. It's a higher in the food chain. It's a pack animal. It's more confident. A cat is a very small creature. It's still okay, but it's a little bit more R-selected. They tend to walk silently around the edges. They're very timid, with the exception of small kittens, which I have the tendency of what I call the kitten cannon, where they'll shoot out of the nest real quick. And they'll do it one at a time. So it's like if the first one didn't get hit by any owl or something, then the second one feels safe. But then the third metaphor I give is the blind dog, and that's the old joke of, if you go to a dog park, they'll say, I didn't know the dog was blind until I rearranged the furniture. The dog is so used to the patterns of the room that it depends on scent, and it's not, it doesn't notice anything until things change. So in Greek cosmology, you had Prometheus and Phaedon. When they went into the heavens, they were punished because that was where the pure things were, and they were carnal. Icarus dies foolishly, Daedalus mourns, and Daedalus actually has his pride punished later on in another story. So there's this wall, this glass ceiling of sorts in Greek cosmology. However, when it came to the seas, they were very dog-like in their bravery. They would go out and you'll have Ulysses and Odysseus chase them. And the stories are very much about facing the threats that faced Greek civilization. You didn't worry about the heavens because the Persians were over there and they wanted to kill you, and all the food was over there in the ocean when you were setting out your fishing vessels. So astronomy was initially boosted in terms of oceanic navigation, and then eventually, when we got past the Ptolemaic model, once that was disproved in the early Renaissance, then we got really good at navigation, and we could move on into global navigation with the seas. So this is just a real quick comparison. Ovid's Metamorphoses. Man was given a towering head and commanded to stand erect and his face uplifted to gaze at the stars of heaven. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, as the heavens declare the glory of God day after day, they pour forth speech, night and after night, they reveal knowledge. In both cases, you have the idea that that which is beautiful and permanent is up there. In Greek cosmology, you had a drive to explore the oceans. In the Great Commission, the idea of spreading Christianity across the earth. In Greek navigation, they had the astrolabe and the Antikythera. In celestial navigation, what was refined with the sextant and the nautical almanac and so forth. And then this is just a real quick historic timeline of how the jump happens after the collapse of Rome. On contrast, though, they considered the high heavens to be very separate. You weren't allowed in the flesh to go there. Even heroes who died went down to the grave underneath. They just went to a better neighborhood of Hades. They didn't go to the heavens unless, with the exception of like Hercules and maybe two others. Anybody who was born human, and Hercules wasn't quite human, went to just a nicer neighborhood of Hades. So the idea that humans would ever go into the skies was completely anathema to them. And anybody who did was punished. In Christianity, you had the idea of the Word becoming flesh, of the heavens coming towards earth, and the idea that you would have interaction with that, and then God would go and prepare a place for you. That idea is not in the Greek. It is entirely in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So when we deal with somebody on an online forum or something who says, oh, well, we've got to clean up all those space probes out there because they're just junk and we're contaminating the heavens and so forth, that's rooted in Hellenistic thought. It is not rooted in anything that has really been valid for the last 2,000 years. If they say that we have to solve all the problems on Earth before we have a space program, we have the same idea of the idea that, oh, don't go out there, all the real issues are here, we're dealing with the Persians. Well, now we're dealing with the Persians again, but that's beside the point. Or when they get it into their head that the radiation belts will kill anybody and we couldn't possibly have really gotten to the moon. There's a cultural bias that reinforces this lie, which was the idea that we didn't actually go to the moon was actually rooted in Cuban propagandists who spread it to the third world. Somehow it got to documentarians in Canada, and here we are. So we have the nautical age, which goes into a more vertical jet with the jet age and the space age. But then when we went to the computer age, We kind of went from an extroverted, outward-facing thing to a more inward-facing thing. As one of my favorite cartoon characters, the Tick, said, you know, back in the old days, science was big. Now everything's just molecule, molecule, molecule. So we could have, with New Space, a new renaissance where we go back to an outward-facing culture with motives and resources and expansion in that direction. Because the alternative is if we have any kind of threat before we get into a new resource level, then we have the idea of a collapse and a chaotic phase. Now, like I said, originally I gave this talk in 2011. And I gave it right after reading G.K. Chesterton's book, What's Wrong with the World, which was written in 1911. And the interesting thing is 2011 was looking a lot like 1911. There was apathetic civilizations that, with atrophied systems, blindsided by technology explosion, cultural shifts, no unclaimed land except for the poles, because by then, you know, we pretty well made up the map. And so when civilizations needed more resources, when they were in that zero-sum game of mercantilism, they had nowhere to go except against each other. And so we ended up with World War I and World War II. We didn't have the idea of the free market where if you make new things, then you can generate wealth out of nothing. And then the ideological despotism led to genocides. It led to collective spirit attack on society. This is probably a key grift that I didn't realize at the time how significant it was. A lot of the conflict in the world is between the societies that value the individual soul and the societies that value the collective spirit. If you look on this side, you have the Islamic civilizations that value a collective spirit. They don't value the individual. You don't value the individual in communism. You don't value the individual in a lot of these cultures. In Western culture in general, and Anglosphere in particular, you have a strong value of the individual soul, the individual accountability, the individual, I'm going to do something. I'm not going to wait for the crowd to do something. So while we had all these conflicts from 1945 to 1970, we did, born out of that fire, create the space age, create the information age. However, we are back at the same situation. So, you know, result 2010, go to line 1110, or 1910. In other words, you have, and subroutine. In other words, if we don't have a paradigm shift, the routine may repeat. So, and I think Dr. Zubrin said this very, very well. If you have a closed system for exploration, it leads to a stagnant paradigm. If you have an open system for exploration, you have a robust technology base, you have robust personas, you have integrity, you have intelligence, you have danger. This commensurate with our core psychology. We need to be in a certain amount of danger to feel normal. And if we are too safe, then we tend to seek danger. And if we're too dangerous, we tend to seek safety. But there is an actual level that is not sitting on the couch that our souls crave. And we go from being the blind dog of being stuck in isolation and so forth to the seeing eye dog of we can lead people out of these sorts of things. So the impact of an exploration paradigm, we open things up to resources, but we have a technological rebirth and a cultural rebirth before that. In other words, the last phase of a 5-phase advancement in our culture is the one that provides direct economic material benefit. We have motivation to go beyond much sooner than that. We actually have a series of ways that benefit us economically, culturally, academically, motivate people to go out and become engineers, become scientists, become astronauts. So we can either have collapse and recovery, or we can have the new tall ships. We can create, you know, dog packs, essentially. The idea of going out in formations if we need security, or individually if we are a little braver about it. Lower cost, you know, basically these were design principles I was putting out there based on the idea of the evolutionary biology of it and the psychology of it. And we could have a new exodus, essentially, getting away from these slaveries of closed systems and creating, even if we do have another collapse, there is hope that there may be a new greatest generation come with that. But if we don't have a collapse, we've saved ourselves 30 years of turmoil. So that's the bottom line. Any questions? Andy? The question was, does going out into space give us a better perspective on our relationship as life forms to the universe? I think that's inevitable. I think we have a better understanding of the sea if we cross the ocean, and life came from the sea. So, or mud, whichever. But the bottom line is that we become more stereoscopic because we know how things were and we know how things are. And I think that gives us binocular vision. In this case, I hope I gave you some binocular vision on language and history of where do these ideas come from? Why do we have certain biases in our culture? Any other questions? Some of that I covered in my last talk on the idea of technology cycles and so forth. It was, when they put it on YouTube, it'll be Structured Settlement was the title of that one. I think Bob Zubrin covered it very well in the last chapter of Energy Victory, and to some degree at the end of Merchants of Despair. I think that there's a lot there of, if we embrace a certain amount of open source, open education, and getting out of these top-down hierarchies and start to own our own face. In other words, we need to move beyond thinking that another institution will give me power, another institution will give me intelligence. I'm going to be intelligent because I'm associated with this group, and this group I call intelligent. No, you're intelligent or you're stupid. It doesn't matter what you believe or what you think. You need to think for yourself. Otherwise, you're just another cog in somebody else's wheel. So you need to move beyond that sort of thing. Any other questions? I think there will be an element of that. I think it's a matter of, I don't think human nature changes, and whenever a group says we're going to change human nature, back off, because that's precisely the sort of, utopians are generally the ones who are also the genocidal cultures. They're like, if everybody just thinks the way we do, then we'll be happy. And the only way we're going to make everybody think the way we do is we kill off everybody who doesn't. We've had way too much of that going on. So I think you have a certain amount of openness within a culture, both and independent thought. I did a talk a couple of years ago on an interstellar culture, which is the idea of, if we go back to the idea of classical liberal arts education, I mean, in terms of grammar, logic, rhetoric, moving forward in knowing how to think and not what to think, then we are able to survive as small independent groups. Because we're going to go back to the structure of a tribal civilization with small groups if we go into space, because you can't fit 1 million people on one ship. It just doesn't work that way. You can't create a global culture on Mars without first becoming a tribal culture on Mars. But you can't have a tribal culture that can run an industrial civilization that's required for breathing on Mars. So that's that dichotomy. That's one of the problems with Mars One, is that they are going on the assumption that it will just happen because we're going to shove more Falcon Heavies out. Yes? It'll be in terms of our culture or in terms of physically? Mindset? I really hope we leave behind the idea of the collective spirit versus the individual soul. And we will have to initially, because you can't have a herd going out and being the first 4 people on Mars or 6 people on Mars. It just doesn't work that way. You're going to die very, very quickly. That said, as civilizations, and I talked about this yesterday, as civilizations go from the pioneer phase to the migrant phase, it's in our nature as part of an RK species to migrate towards a more lackadaisical mindset. So will that cycle happen again? Quite probably, just because of who we are. Was there one more? Yeah. And then we got to break for the next one. Well, we kind of saw that with the Goddard versus von Braun, because von Braun assembled a team and he went to the moon, and Goddard was very cagey, and he didn't get very far, even though he was first. So yeah, that's always a challenge. I think there's a lot to be said for cooperative development and forming teams. I'm kind of working on a project like that quietly for now, because it's just a little too valuable to just spill out there right now. But I think that as we move forward, there will have to be a certain amount of interdependence. So anyway, thank you.